So we're listening to Is Valve Canceling Native Games by Gardiner Bryant, formerly known as the Linux Gamer, right? This is a long video on this
Valve
topic.
pushing game developers to support Proton rather than making native Linux games? Let's talk about this. Now, it might seem ludicrous to a lot of people to hear that Valve, a company that just released all of the details about the Steam Deck, their Linux-powered gaming console, would be reaching out to developers who have already published Linux games on Steam and asking them to remove the Linux game and instead target Proton with their Windows version. But this...
Yeah, that does sound ludicrous. That they are actually telling them to remove the Linux versions? Why would that be a reason? I mean, Proton is great and all, and they might be reaching out to tell them to focus on Proton.
Seems to be actually happening. Noted Linux game developer Ethan Lee, the force behind the FNA game framework and ports such as Fez, Transistor, Celeste, Rogue Legacy, Owlboy, and so many more, recently tweeted this. If you have released a Linux version of your game on Steam and are directly approached by Valve about using Proton instead, please get in touch. DMs are open. They've already done this a few times, but I would like to see how aggressive they're planning to be going forward. Naturally, some people chimed in dismay. Gaming on Linux said this: I really don't get why they would do that. It only increases their own support burden with Proton, and if the Linux port works, well, then it's just pointless.
Yeah, right. Removing Linux support. It's kind of... this is just like a reportings, right? It's just anecdotal so far. And that could be an interpretation issue in my mind, right? That it can be... Wait, what was that? Go back a few seconds.
Dismay. Gaming on Linux said this:
If you release a Linux version of your game and directly approach about using Proton instead. Oh no, I mean, that can be an interpretation thing, right? If Valve approaches you and tells you, oh, can you do this to make it work on Proton? Or could you focus on Proton? It becomes vague, maybe not interpretation.
I really don't get why they would do that. It only increases their own support burden with Proton, and if the Linux port...
One argument to respond to gaming on Linux here, right? It's not pointless. One way of doing that is to lock down the Linux community, right? That would be good for business. If people do native Linux versions of their games, any storefront can sell that Linux version, but only Valve can sell the Proton games. That's an interesting... That would be good business, wouldn't it?
If it works, well, then it's just pointless. And Joshi added, this is by no means related to any of the work you do, talking about Ethan Lee, and my personal opinion, but there are a lot of game ports that really suck ass, and Proton would be much better given the company has since fired everyone that works on it, or the porting studio doesn't exist anymore. So if...
For the gamer, yeah, Proton is... right, you can... If the developer doesn't support the Linux version, then kind of it makes sense. Right, to have, if the Windows version is supported, right, the developer only has to support one version. Not says Proton is built on open source, anyone can use it. That's a good point. That is a very good point. Yeah, any of the storefronts could implement their own version, right? They probably wouldn't name it Proton. They would probably give it some other name instead of Wine and DXVK and all of that. That's a very good point. Note says, I like having the choice. If the Linux port isn't working for some reason, I could use Proton instead. Me too, yeah. That has happened more than once, that the Linux port wasn't really up to snuff, and I tried just using Wine or Proton instead. Most recently, Hollow Knight, right? I had problems with Hollow Knight, and I just ran it through Wine, and it was working fine. Nodon says, yep, same.
If it is true that Valve are approaching developers who have already put their Linux client on Steam and asking them to delist the native Linux client in favor of supporting Proton instead.
All right, here we go. I have not seen any evidence for what he's saying here. Removing? That's so far from the tweets, right? We have not gotten anyone claiming that Valve is telling people to remove the Linux versions, right? At best, they have asked to focus on Proton. Maybe? Nodon says that Crypt of the Necrodancer was like that. It was better with Wine and Proton, and Farm Together was like that as well. I don't even remember. It was a few games I've had that happen with, but I don't remember which games it was for me.
What does that mean for us? Surely using Proton adds extra baggage and overhead, and native performance of games would be better, right?
Not necessarily, but generally I would agree with his point on that native games generally would be better, right? It's less bloat. Nodonor says, I have not noticed any games I own on Steam that have removed the Linux version, except for Rocket League, of course. Wait, did Rocket League remove their Linux version? But that now, around this time? Did it happen recently or a long time ago? I hadn't heard about that at all. I'm actually surprised that you've never mentioned that before. That sounds like something that would frustrate you.
I mean, right? Not so fast. I think that there are a few reasons that it might seem reasonable from Valve's point of view to kill off native Linux binaries and just go with Proton. Now, I can hear the angry mob in the comments already. I can't believe this fanboy shill is defending the death of native Linux gaming.
He was not shilling, he was just saying he can think of a few reasons, and I'm curious about those reasons. I was thinking about one reason, but that, like you said, since Proton is open source, it was not the best type of reason. It is still a reason though, because I mean, I've looked at the Epic Game Store and it's terrible. I've looked at GOG and GOG have no plans of making like super Linux supportive stuff, so them implementing a Proton thing or a Wine thing in their storefront is far from happening, and Epic is just super terrible at developing their storefront. However, I could imagine, because the legendary or heroic game store, I can imagine them implementing Proton soon enough. Just taking Proton and putting it in the open source variation, so that would not help Valve in the long run. And Valve seems to be playing the long game. That's my understanding anyway. Nodon says that Rocket League removed Linux support basically as soon as Psyonix was acquired by Epic Games. Oh, fucking Epic. Nodon says Steam is open enough that you can literally install Epic Launcher on Steam manually and play every game through Proton. Oh, that's one way of doing it. I just installed and tried to play around with the legendary game installer because I really like that. Having what's it called? It's just a terminal interface. Yeah, it's a terminal interface, and I like that.
What happened to the Linux gamer? Now, I am by no means defending this decision, okay? If this is the case, and it still remains unclear if this is true, I simply want to understand it. So let's actually dive into why Valve might consider killing off native Linux binaries through Steam. But first, let's talk about the sponsor of this video, Shells. Shells do any virtual close operating mint and affordable
I'm just
free
gonna
to
skip his ad, yeah.
through
Skip the ad.
Proton. It's been known for a while that running Windows-only video games through Proton on Linux has improved some frame rates in some games. And in some instances, it's even improved stability of the game, you playing the game on Proton versus on Windows. But it's also been noted that running the Windows client on Linux versus running the Linux client on Linux has resulted in one of three things: either marginal performance loss, no discernible difference between the Linux and Windows binaries, or in some extreme cases, the Windows binary performing better on Linux through Proton than the native Linux client does.
Alright, I want to point out that neither of these things are arguments against Linux binaries. Just that something might run better with Proton. Well, actually, that maybe would be a short-term... That might be a short-term argument. Maybe they want everything to just work snappy in the Steam Deck, right? They want everything to just work out of the box, and they feel that they have it's like they have Proton is such AoE attack, right? You can make many different games work with Proton. Well, if there's something wrong with a game on Linux and the Linux binaries, then you would have to look in, be better at Linux instead of being better at Windows. So maybe a short-term argument would be that.
Now, that might seem a little counterintuitive. Why would running a game through the compatibility layer of Wine result in better performance than running the native Linux client when there's less overhead?
No, that's one reason I could see not targeting Linux natively is because you have to target too many distributions. But with the Steam Deck, you only need to target one hardware and one OS. Oh, right. But that wouldn't make sense for, well, right, you don't even have to target, well, why is that's not an argument for Valve though, is it? That's just for developers, just targeting one thing, one hardware, one OS. I think they can be targeting Windows still, right? For a lot of developers, that makes sense. Targeting Windows and Proton rather than trying to make both for, if you want to make your game for Windows and for Linux, or Windows and the Steam Deck, then it's better to just make it work with Proton. It's probably easier for the developer to make it work on Proton rather than making a complete standalone Linux binary. Maybe. I mean, it depends on the engine and whatnot, of course, but that could be... That could make sense why Valve would be doing that as well, because they would want to make it easier for the developers and not having a big step. Like, compare it to making a game for Windows and for PlayStation or Xbox. That's gotta be way different. While making it for Windows and Proton, that's not way different then. No, says, I kind of want to download and back up all my native Linux games just in case. Oh. I've been actually been thinking about that, just downloading, well, like buying big external hard drives and just putting a lot of games on there and just having them just in case. Like having backups. That's always a good idea if you have the space for it.
It's simple. There really are only two reasons for this. The first reason is that the Windows version gets the most development time.
Yeah.
And the second reason is that game developers are just simply more familiar with Windows and Microsoft APIs. And I'm not saying they're generally more capable of programming for Windows than they are for Linux. We're talking orders of magnitude. We have to remember that us small Linux niche community, very few people actually use Linux when you compare it to the number of PCs in the world, and even fewer
Indeed.
of them develop cross-platform.
Indeed, that's like a good point. But that, like, if Valve is moving the direction, right? We were talking about that the other day, that the feeling was that Valve is trying to make Linux the future of gaming. Maybe that is not the case. Maybe they're just using Linux on their machine because it makes sense to use Linux on their machine. But they don't necessarily need, because the overhead is negligible. Maybe? I don't know, since I have 2 terabytes to work with, I don't know if that's enough. I mean, all of them might be a bit much. Just take the ones that you really care about, maybe.
Now, let's keep that in the back of our mind for a moment and move on to another thing, another reason why Valve is heavily investing in Proton specifically. You probably have a lot of games in your Steam library. I have over 600 in mine, and there are some 10,000 plus titles on Steam. Valve can't sell you a box and say, you can have any game on Steam that you want as long as it's one that has the little penguin badge on the sale page. They can't. I mean, that's literally not an option. They have tried that. They tried that in 2015 and it failed. They put in all this time and effort into the Steam for Linux initiative, the Steam Linux runtime. They developed SteamOS 1.0. They gathered all these OEMs together and foisted the half-baked Steam Machine program on the general public. It was a typically mid-2010s Valve move, if you ask me, relying on third parties to assume the risk of manufacturing the hardware and earnestly believing that the goodwill of the Reddit cult of Gabe would, see them to the moon. But it failed because they didn't think through their program. They didn't consider the fact that it's a pretty hard sell to ask your loyal customers who've spent literally thousands of dollars on your platform to buy a machine that was overpriced, underpowered, and could only play a fraction of the library they already owned. And in reality, it was an even harder sell for Valve to ask PC game developers to bring on new Linux game developer talent when the number of people who would be buying these Linux games would not probably ever justify the cost of hiring these developers. So
what he's saying is pretty much that the point is that they've spent all this time and effort and resources to develop Proton, and they're so happy with it, and they just want people to use it instead of making the same mistake again. That might be onto something. That sounds interesting. Now, says, I see Linux for Valve as investing in a backup plan. They got wind that Microsoft might lock down software on Windows somehow and shut down their business. They need Linux as a platform to sell their games and hardware. Yeah, exactly. But what if Windows somehow locks down and stops Wine from working, right? They're dependent on Proton. They're still dependent on Windows with Proton, right? Because maybe Windows will do some shenanigans and will just break Proton. Is that possible? No, I don't think that's possible. They would have to break the games. The games would have to be designed in a way. Windows is not really relevant in that at all. if the game runs on Proton or not. Windows cannot do anything about that. Only the game developers can do that. And I mean, that's one way they're defending against this as well, I suppose, by making Proton bigger. They defend against some sort of norm shift in the game dev sphere. Maybe? I don't know. Nodon says, imagine being a PC gamer and buying a second PC that's worse in every way. That's the Steam Machine sales pitch. Indeed. Yeah. I was not interested in that, like, at all. Nodon says, Windows has always been backwards compatible first. That's why Proton works so well. Nice. Nice.
That's why Valve retooled, and in 2018 they released Steam Play Proton. Proton is a Windows compatibility layer for Steam. It allows all of the Windows games, or many of the Windows games on Steam, to be played through Linux, through this compatibility layer. Proton fills in the gap between x86 assembly and the Windows API calls that the game expects to be there. Things like routines to draw a window to the screen, or play sound effects, or even things like DirectX calls. Proton creates a stable, backwards compatible runtime that games can depend on. And it's a runtime that really doesn't add that much overhead or substantively harm the experience of the game. Meanwhile, some native Linux games have clear problems that many of us are unwilling to admit. Dependency rot. I have several games in my Steam library that used to work great when they were first released, but have either broken in some way, have tons of glitches now, or just simply refuse to boot. I mean, you can no longer play the Johann Sebastian Joust minigame in Sports Friends because it relied on a very specific Bluetooth dependency. Borderlands 2 also has major audio issues. BioShock Infinite also has problems. But then you have developers who have simply ended Linux support for their games. We're talking Rust. We're talking Rocket League. They don't do this to spite us, the Linux community. They do this because the cost of maintaining two separate PC ports of the game is high, maybe unjustifiably so. Especially when the talent to maintain Linux ports just isn't there. Let's also not forget about the myriad of Unity engine ports that get crapped out, left untested, and just put on Steam. They're not optimal.
All these arguments are pretty good, and actually, I could see why they would want to go the Proton route. Right? If the overhead is not that bad, and Proton, it kind of just works, doesn't it? When it works, sometimes there are a few issues with it, but Valve is gonna make sure it works now. Like, if it works on Windows, it is going to work on Linux. That's pretty much what they're saying. That's pretty much the goal. And the best way to do that is to take that responsibility themselves. Yeah. For Valve to take that an open source responsibility. It's in the Linux, right? It's the Linux community's responsibility, right? Valve is doing a lot of it, but like we've got Wine doing a lot of it, DXVK doing a lot of it. But having that responsibility in that location makes a lot of sense, yeah. Rather than doing the native thing and putting that responsibility on other people, the developers. The developers just want to make their games. They don't want to be... I can imagine, right? A lot of developers not wanting to be in the situation where it's like, oh, I have to do for this and that and a lot of extra work. What they want to do is design their games and sell their games, right? Nodon says, if you statically compile your binary or target the Steam runtime, there's no reason that the Linux ports can't work for a long time. Oh, you're talking about the dependency rot thing? Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, statically compile them. But that, again, like, that puts... Where does that put the responsibility? And Valve wants to take that responsibility themselves. And that makes sense to me. I like that argument that he's doing. Canceling native games. Noteowner says, most game developers just hit the export button for Linux with no further effort. Exactly. And some developers might even think that is too much effort. And Valve just wants to make it easy for them. Right? That's one way of looking at it. Noteowner says, I do trust Valve and the community more than the individual game developers. Yeah, exactly. This is the world we live in, right? We live in a world where games for the last, I don't know, forever have been developed primarily for Windows. That's the reality we find ourselves in. And that's most of the game development tools are built around that. And most game developing like software and developers and whatnot, they are used to this. So having a switch to Linux might be a great thing for everybody involved, but that's not in Valve's best interest. That's just in, if you're a firm believer in the free and open source software, which is not, that is not Valve's main mission, right? Valve's main mission is to make money. They don't do it from a political, for a political reason. They just do it for their own reasons.
Optimized for Linux. They just click the little export to Linux button, and they barely work, a lot of them. And let's not try and kid ourselves about any of this. Look, Linux is great for free and open source software. The Linux way, TM, is perfect for FOSS use cases. We build all of our open source software against all of the other latest versions of the dependencies that it needs, the other open source software. This software is maintained and updated by loyal and dedicated communities, people who are passionate about this, and it just works harmoniously in most cases. But you have to admit that the Linux way is actually pretty hostile to proprietary software. If a proprietary dev hasn't bought into this idea of constant iteration and constant upgrade and constant maintenance, well, then they get left behind. Perhaps
that's also a very good point. There is, hostile towards proprietary software, and that is how most Linux users want it, right? We want it hostile. We don't want proprietary bullshit, right? There is, I can imagine, like, most Linux gamers or Linux users, you would find them being hostile towards NVIDIA just because of they would prefer to buy an AMD in the future rather than an NVIDIA, because NVIDIA, we're hostile towards it. It doesn't work within the Linux way, the Linux way of doing things. Yeah. So it also makes sense to somehow have an overlap, a bridge between those two philosophies. And Steam can place themselves as that bridge with Proton. Yeah. We're far away off from having all our games being free and open source. Yeah, that's gonna be a while. That won't happen in my lifetime. That is the goal, and Linux is built around that goal, I guess. But it's gonna take a while. And in the meantime, Valve can make all the money.
That's by design. I'm not gonna make a value judgment on that, because I think
Noteowner says, how do we make that happen faster? Going toward that gaming on Linux, right? Gaming on Linux That's why long term, when everything works on Proton, we can make, for the people who don't care about the philosophy or the politics of free and open source software, right? I think that PCs, a lot of it today is gaming, and we're talking about gaming right now. Right? That, yeah, my father was away and he was buying a new computer the other day, a new laptop, and they were looking around, and he got the feeling like 70% of all the PC stuff and laptop stuff, all the computer stuff, personal computers, laptop, and stationary, he said like it's all gaming stuff. So if you want to have that market, we need gamers to start using Linux. And as long as the gamer can say that, well, gaming on Windows is better, as long as that works, right? And we have to concede that, sure, but we're getting fucking close, and we will get to, right? I can see a foreseeable future soon where we can say that no, gaming is better. Well, we don't even have to say it's better, it's equal, right? It's no different. We can say that for a fact. There is no difference. It just works. So then we can do all the other arguments for why Linux and free and open source things are better. It's way easier to get people onto Linux through gaming. Nodorn says, I'd even be okay if game engines were open source, but the assets were copyrighted. Yeah, exactly. That's one way of doing it. Nodorn says, since everyone is using the same engine, Unity, if Unity was free software, that would be a huge step forward, but Unity is a for-profit company. Yeah, I like Godot or Godot, depending on who you are. I like that approach. And there's also, right, they're trying to make another open source engine, right? The Linux engine or whatever it's called. There is work on that front as well, trying to get more and more people into free and open source engines as well. So the way we make it happen faster, moving towards a free and open source future, is adoption. Right? That's got to be it. Just the means justify the ends kind of attitude. A little bit of open source is better than no open source. The more people we get to start using Linux, the more people get used to the Linux way of doing things. And the more you get used to the Linux way of doing things, the more you want the Linux way of doing things, because it's... I mean, I want to say it's better, but that's just me being biased. Is it better? I don't know. It's better for me. It's better for the hardware. It's better... It's difficult to say, actually. I don't know. I don't think either of us or Bryant here is can make a proper unbiased view on that question. Hold on, it says Amazon Lumberyard. Exactly, yeah, Amazon Lumberyard. I didn't look into it. I just saw it in the periphery on your in the Linux news things that you have. Linux Gamer News in Discord. We were talking about that a bit. All right, let's keep watching.
That they are two very different use cases for software, but it does result in Linux software preservation looking like digging out an old, Ubuntu disk, running that in like a virtual machine and installing your games that way. I mean, seriously, good luck trying to run any Loki games release on a modern distro. You're not going to do it. We're talking like Heroes of Might and Magic or SimCity 3000, games like this that had a Linux release way back and right now require such old dependencies that it's just not going to happen. You'd have much better luck trying to run the Windows versions of these games through Proton. And that's kind of the point. And look, a lot of these problems Valve have actually tried to tackle with the Steam Linux runtime, right? I've mentioned that a couple times already in this video. But that kind of leads me to my last point. What's the difference between the Linux?
All right. It says, fun fact, you can run Loki games with your Steam version using Lux Torpedo. Loki games? What are Loki games? Whoops. Oh, what was that? LokiCraft? LokiGames.com. Here we go. Will remain open. All right, we've got products. Oh, wow. What is this? Quake 3. RT2? They were just a company that was contracted back in the day to port games to Linux. All right, right. Like Heroes 3. There we go. A lot of ports. And they all work on Lux Torpedo, which is, for those who don't know, Lux Torpedo is similar to Proton, but different. Yeah, it's not similar. It's out of the scope. Let's see what the next point he's making. But I can highly recommend Lux Torpedo. It's a great project.
Steam runtime and Proton. I'm serious. I mean, some people are going to argue minutia on this point, but I don't think that there is much, if any, of a substantive difference between the two. Proton is a collection of software libraries that Steam games depend on in order to be able to run. And the Steam runtime, it's kind of the same thing. But that raises the question, how many runtimes does Steam for Linux actually need? What is the cost of maintaining two separate runtimes for Steam games? Especially when you consider that Steam for Linux currently only has about 2% or maybe even less of the total global Steam user base. And it sucks, but in business, I mean, sometimes it just comes down to numbers. If the majority of game developers, and I mean, I'm talking the vast majority of developers, are proficient with developing with Windows and have almost no experience with Linux, if 80% of the games on Steam exclusively target Windows with absolutely zero indication that that's going to change in any meaningful way, and when only considering legacy titles, something more like 85 or 90% of games support Windows only. If many of the native Linux games get abandoned by their developers and stop receiving updates or provide a subpar experience to end users, thereby negatively impacting the public perception of SteamOS as a platform, and if Proton has negligible impacts upon the end user experience, then it really becomes hard to justify having two parallel runtimes.
That's excellent. Yeah, it's a very good point. They want to get rid of that, but it's also right when they reach out to the developers, they're doing them a favor, the developers a favor, right? If you don't want to do the Linux thing anymore, right? You want the game to be playable on Linux, but you don't want to, right? You don't care that much about it, then we'll take care of it. We'll take care of it with Proton. Right, because and yeah, the Linux runtime thing, it would make sense to get rid of that, right? It would be easier to just put all your eggs in one basket for them. But the developer, right, they're not trying to cancel that, right? It's up to the developer. If the developer wants to make their games work on Linux, they can do that. Just don't target the Linux runtime. Target Linux. It's interesting. Wait, oh, sorry, I missed the context of that. Not all of them, but Unreal Tournament at least. It works great. Oh, the Lux Torpedo stuff? Wait, does Lux Torpedo play Unreal Tournament? I didn't know that.
The continued development cost and maintenance of these two separate runtimes, doesn't it? just tell a developer who's already published a game on Linux to target Proton instead.
And that makes sense. Oh, great pause phase here. Yeah, the best pause phase. No. I think it's one step backwards, two steps forward. If we have to rely on Wine to play games and the result is more Linux adoptions, that could be an overall net positive. I agree. Yeah. Linux adoption, right? That's the end goal for people like you and me, I think, Nodrunner. Politically speaking, when we are FOSS nerds and we want to see free and open source software, yeah, more Linux adoption.
All your resources behind developing Proton. It makes business sense. The games will work better in the long run, and almost no one will be able to tell the difference. Does that make it right? In 1997 at WWDC, Steve Jobs was asked a question. He was asked why Steve Jobs and Apple had ditched a superior technology in favor of something more mundane. Jobs replied, "One of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that the naysayers are usually right about a lot of things. But one of the things that I've always found was that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out how you're going to sell it. As we've tried to come up with a strategy for Apple, we've started with the question, what benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? We don't start with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what incredible technology we have and then decide how we're going to market that." And it might seem like sacrilege to acknowledge the truth in Steve Jobs' words, especially on this channel. But honestly, that's how the market works. That's how products work. And Linux kind of lives outside of all of that. We're an enthusiast community. We're a bunch of engineers who don't need to worry about marketing or end user experience, even in a lot of cases. It might feel good to know that, all of the games running on your Steam Deck are native Linux versions. And
let's see. Nodrunner says, then we'll have to switch to some new operating system, and that's even more obscure and esoteric. I don't know if my beard is ready for BSD. I think yours is almost there. Oh, mine is ready for BSD. Mine will not get bigger than this. This is my beard. Right. This is the how long it will go. I am not ready for BSD though, not yet anyway. But my beard is. Yeah, all of it. And I'm looking forward to trying BSD one day in the future, but that will not be for playing games. Yeah. And maybe some other operating system in the future as well. Who knows? Right, I want to just go back a few seconds. You felt like I paused in the middle of his thing here.
That, all of the games running on your Steam Deck are native Linux versions. And because we are the proud Linux papas that we are, we might be willing to overlook the flaws that are there. I've done.
Yeah, I really like this argument. It's why Linux people would dislike this Proton switch. Right? It's more emotional than it is actually future thinking. Right? Of course, I would prefer, emotionally speaking, if all my games ever always was Linux native. But the pragmatist in me says, like, I would not be one of the people noticing if it works, it works. And then it works through Proton, and I'm happy with that. There could be emotional reasonings why. Yeah. Purist reasons. Right, now the cat is in the way, so I can't read the chat. If you were reading something, I think so. Nowdowner says, I found a curator that recommends games that runs on BSD. Oh, that's hilarious. Let's see that. Want to follow that. Play on BSD. Nice. 26 followers. They're just, oh, it's quite a few games. Oh. Even a game that I own runs with Hashlink. Terraria runs as well. Terraria is great. Oh wow, there's quite a few games in here. Quite. Look at that. Interesting.
That I'm guilty of that super hard. And it might hit the pleasure centers of our Linux brains if Valve were to come out and say native Linux games only on the Steam Deck. But frankly,
No.
if a not insignificant portion of the native Linux games get abandoned by the developer after just a few iterations of releases, or if it adds too much of a development burden for the devs to port and maintain these games, or they aren't familiar enough with Linux to do a good job in porting to begin with, to optimize the game for the Steam Deck, well then the end user suffers.
You've heard me make that argument time and time again, so I'll just point it out again. Well, it's not an argument, it's just what I want to see is small iterative steps towards a goal. That makes sense to me. And this is a small step towards the free and open source future. Yeah. Odin says, I know, right? Let's all become BSD gamers now. Oh man, I'll be a BSD gamer in the future. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know enough about BSD.
User experience is worse. And why would someone buy an inferior product? It's why so many core gamers hate motion controls. It's because the Wii sold on novelty and not on experience. The Waggle novelty was accessible for, old people and young kids, but it was an inferior experience. And even though today, when you use motion controls correctly on the Steam Deck, for example, or on the Switch, it's a much better experience than just using an analog stick on its own. Core gamers can't get that bad taste out of their mouth. That's what this is about. This is about having a good experience for the customer. Fact is, like it or not, in most instances, Proton can play the best version of the game. And like it or not, the best version of a PC port of a game is the Windows version. It's the version that the developers spent the most time on, the version that is the most optimized. Yeah. And look, I'm by no means trying to poo-poo on the work of like Ryan Gordon or Ethan Lee. These guys are some of the standouts in the community, and they support their games for much longer than most other devs who have released a Linux game. I have hundreds of native Linux games in my Steam library, and I would say the majority of them either come from Ryan or from Ethan, but they're kind of islands unto themselves.
Yeah, and good
point. At least for now, Valve's not going to convince any publishers, any developers out there to bring on talent for to develop games for an unproven platform. That's the reality of the situation. And it was the reality of the situation with the Steam machines too. It sucks and I don't like it, and I'm not trying to justify it, but I can understand where Valve's coming from here. But before we dig out all of our pitchforks and torches, it's worth considering exactly what we're losing if Valve does go down the Proton-only path. I mean, if Valve kills off native Linux games, what have we lost?
All right, I want to point out that they will not be cancelled out. They will not kill off Linux native games. That will not happen, right? The developers that care about free and open source and Linux stuff, they will keep releasing Linux games, whatever Valve say, right? They will not kill it off. So the consequence is not Valve killing off Linux native games at all. Valve is just giving the developers an opportunity and an easier way of doing what it is they do. And I think that's great. From the developers' side, right? They're making lives easier for developers, which is great. Less jobs, less work, right? Less work for them. So, just as a caveat for whatever he's going to say next.
Imperceptible half dozen of FPS, our dignity. Some would argue that real FOSS enthusiasts wouldn't bother playing proprietary games to begin with. We still have our free and open source systems, you know.
Real enthusiasts. I remember that when I was a young teenager. I was into black metal and death metal and that type of music. And you had to be a real metal fan, right? You were not allowed to listen to rock or, I don't know, some stuff like Sellout Metallica. That's not real metal. You can't listen to Metallica, stuff like that. And it's so childish. And I was a child, so I feel the same about real FOSS enthusiasts. I think you can be a FOSS enthusiast and use Windows on your daily computer. I think that's fine. I think that's completely fine.
No. We still have the freedom to do whatever we want with our machines.
Exactly.
This isn't going to be the end of native Linux anything, except for on Steam. And I think that very little will change for the worse here. I think if the Steam Deck is a success, this could usher in a brand new era, a brand new revolution for Steam games, for Linux gaming.
I completely agree with that. But he did make a point, something that sounds interesting, is what are the negative effects of this from a free and open source future perspective, right? What are the negative consequences of less native games? A lot of people's feelings, right? It doesn't feel good for the people who has that emotional response that, oh man, I really liked having native games. That feeling that's a negative aspect, but is that only it? Nodonor says, I've thought about making a game and making it not only Linux native, but Linux exclusive. That sounds fun. All right, we had... I'm terrible with names. I still have this. I mean, if you're interested in... you have it here. Actually, I'll just link it. There you go. Man, it's not even old Reddit. I'm sorry. I know you like old Reddit, but... it's one of the dudes that have been hanging out here from time to time. He started making a Linux exclusive game, but this is more, it's like an old RPG stuff. Yeah. But yeah, it's fun making Linux exclusive stuff. Oh man. Like a lot of people who are into this kind of stuff, I've been thinking about making games as well, and I didn't even think about that, but maybe one should do it Linux exclusive if I ever make a game. If I ever finish making a game, which I won't. I get bored too quickly when doing that type of work. Maybe I could help out. I don't know.
And so I think there's more to be gained than there is to be lost if they go down this road. I know a lot of people are going to hate this video, and that's fine. I want to reiterate that I'm not justifying this course of action. I'm just trying to understand it. And I spent like a good solid 3.5 hours last night writing this 6-page essay, and now I'm reciting it back to you. So if you like this kind of work, if you like the work that I do here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because it really helps us out. You can hit that like button if you're so inclined. But that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much.
I thought this was a great essay. Yeah, great essay, indeed. Where's that? There we go. We press that button. Yeah, I thought he did a good job, and he made definitely thoughts that I hadn't had before in ways. Probably flipped my thinking about this completely. But I'm all for canceling native games now. Short term. Nodon says, why would you export for Windows? Pushing that button is too much effort. Exactly. Exporting for Windows? Well, I think if I would make a game, I would probably... Actually, I don't know. What I have been working on, but I haven't worked on it on months, but what I did work on was just from C. I didn't have a game engine or whatever. I was just playing around in C. I was actually thinking about making a game in the command line. Well, no, like maybe a curse thing, and curses. I don't know. I thought this video was great, and I think that, yeah, fuck native games. If the developers don't want to make native games, fuck them. And thank you, Valve, for making all the games work on Linux. That's what I think. Steam Deck, I'm hyped about it. I'm hyped about getting the anti-cheat stuff to work on Linux. I'm excited to play Hunt Showdown. I'm excited to play that other, Escape from Tarkov. Yeah. Maybe even one of the battle royales. I haven't spent proper time actually in a battle royale, so maybe I would enjoy that. So thank you, Valve, if you are fixing that for me. That is great news for me.